A sharp, metallic screech tore through the suffocating darkness, echoing down the rusted corridors of a derelict spaceship adrift in the endless void of space. The sound reverberated like a dying beast scream, bouncing off the jagged walls of the Aurora 7, a once mighty human vessel now reduced to a haunted shell. Flickering green light sliced through the haze, casting jagged, shifting shadows that danced across the walls as a figure emerged from the gloom. A female alien warrior, her presence as deadly as it was mesmerizing. Her black armor clung to her lithe form like liquid obsidian, glowing faintly with intricate patterns that pulsed like veins of energy, each shimmer a testament to the advanced technology of her species. In her hand, a slender sword hummed with an eerie green glow, its light weaving through the air like liquid fire, illuminating her piercing emerald eyes that burned with a cold, unrelenting fire. Her long, raven-black hair whipped wildly in the stale, recycled air of the ship, as if alive with the tension of the moment, catching the faint glow of her weapon in a way that made her look almost ethereal. She stepped forward, her movements fluid and predatory, the faint buzz of her insect-like wings sending a shiver through the atmosphere. The wings, translucent and razor-sharp, vibrated with a low hum that seemed to resonate with the ship's own dying systems, creating an unsettling harmony. In the shadows, another figure crouched, a human, his silhouette barely discernible in the dim light. His chest heaved with ragged, desperate breaths, sweat dripping from his brow and stinging his eyes as he clutched a jagged piece of broken metal, the only weapon he had in this forsaken place. His brown eyes darted toward the warrior, sharp with defiance but shadowed with exhaustion, the kind that came from days of running, fighting, and surviving against impossible odds. Blood streaked his torn pilot's uniform, the fabric hanging in tatters around his lean frame, yet his grip on the makeshift weapon didn't waver. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a flicker of stubborn resolve that seemed almost out of place in the face of such overwhelming danger. Who was this man? How had a mere human, a species the Zereth considered weak, fragile, unworthy, survived this long in a maze designed to kill? And more importantly, could he outwit a creature born for war, a being whose every move screamed danger and power, whose very presence seemed to bend the air around her with an aura of lethal grace? The air crackled with unspoken questions as the alien warrior raised her sword, the green glow casting a haunting light across her sharp features. Her lips curled into a smirk that promised violence, her eyes narrowing as she sized up her prey. This was no ordinary fight. This was a test of survival, a clash of worlds, human resilience against alien supremacy. And the answers were coming, whether he was ready or not. Stick around, because what happens next will leave you on the edge of your seat, questioning everything you thought you knew about strength, survival, and the unbreakable spirit of humanity. The ship was a graveyard of forgotten dreams, a hulking relic of human ambition now reduced to a tomb floating aimlessly in the black sea of space. Once a proud research outpost named Aurora 7, it had been a beacon of exploration, a shining testament to humanity's relentless drive to conquer the stars. Its sleek hull had once gleamed under the light of distant suns, its corridors bustling with scientists, engineers, and explorers dreaming of new frontiers. But that was years ago, before the Zereth came. The insectoid alien species had swarmed the vessel in a brutal raid, their ships tearing through its defenses like a swarm of locusts through a wheat field. Now, the Aurora 7 was a shadow of its former self, a decaying husk adrift in the void. Dim, flickering lights cast eerie glows across walls pocked with burn marks, claw scratches, and the faint outlines of faded human graffiti, remnants of a crew that had fought to their last breath. The air was thick with the acrid stench of scorched metal, mingled with the dusty tang of long-dead machinery and a faint, unsettling sweetness that Rook couldn't quite place but made his stomach churn. Every creak of the hull sounded like a whisper of death, a reminder that this ship was no longer a sanctuary, but a predator's lair. The distant hum of malfunctioning systems buzzed like a swarm of angry hornets, a constant drone that grated on the nerves and made it impossible to tell if danger was lurking around the next corner. The Xerath had transformed the ship's lower decks into a twisted maze for their survival trials, a cruel ritual where they pitted captives against their warriors and traps to weed out the weak. The maze was a nightmare of narrow passages, rusted grates, and sparking electrical panels that could fry a man in seconds if he wasn't careful. Jagged metal spikes protruded from walls at random intervals, their tips stained with the dried blood of those who hadn't been quick. Rook Halstead wasn't supposed to be here, not in a million years. He'd been a pilot, not a soldier, a man more at home behind the controls of Starfighter than the middle of a death trap, surrounded by alien bugs who wanted to turn him into their next meal. But fate had a funny way of screwing with plans, and now here he was, standing in the belly of a rotting spaceship, staring down creatures that looked like they crawled straight out of a nightmare he'd had after eating bad rations. Rook was tall, but lean, his frame built for speed rather than brute strength, with a wiry kind of toughness that came from years of dodging asteroid fields and outrunning pirates in the Outer Rim. His dark brown hair was a mess, sticking to his forehead with sweat, and his sharp hazel eyes scanned the chamber with a mix of wariness and defiance, taking in every detail. The flickering lights, the skittering Xerath, the faint hum of Klyra's glowing sword. His pilot's uniform was a tattered mess, scorched at the edges from a plasma blast, torn at the shoulder where his Xerath claw had grazed him, and stained with grime from the crash that had landed him in this mess. A faint scar ran across his left cheek, a souvenir from a bar fight he'd rather forget, and his hands were rough from years of manual repairs on his ship. He'd been on a routine patrol, mapping a new trade route for the Galactic Coalition, when his ship got jumped by a Xerath raiding party. 1 minute, he was dodging plasma bolts in 0G, weaving through a debris field with the skill of a man who'd been born in the cockpit. The next, he was waking up in a holding cell with a splitting headache, a bruised rib, and a distinct lack of coffee to make the day bearable. That was 3 days ago. Since then, he'd been dragged through interrogation, poked at by Xerath scientists who seemed baffled by his fragile biology, their cold, clawed hands prodding at him as they muttered in their clicking language about how humans shouldn't even be able to stand after what he'd been through. They'd finally dumped him into this trial with nothing but a broken piece of metal to defend himself, expecting him to be dead within minutes. Most people would have panicked. Rook? He just sighed, rolled his shoulders, and muttered to himself, "I've been through worse. This is just another bad day." He wasn't a warrior, not by any stretch. He'd failed basic combat training twice back at the academy, mostly because he'd kept cracking jokes during drills, but he had something the Xerath didn't expect, a knack for surviving and a stubborn streak a mile wide that refused to let him go down without a fight. As the crowd hissed and clicked, their mandibles snapping in anticipation, Rook cracked his neck and shot them a lopsided grin. "Let's get this over with," he said under his breath, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his brow. "I've got a burger waiting for me somewhere out there, and I'm not dying until I get it." From the elevated platform overlooking the chamber, a figure stepped into the flickering light, and the crowd of Xerath fell silent, their chattering mandibles stilled by her presence. Klyra, a high-ranking Xerath warrior, was a vision of deadly beauty, a predator cloaked in elegance and danger. Her black armor hugged her lithe form like liquid obsidian, accentuating every curve with a faint shimmer of energy that pulsed through the suit's intricate patterns, glowing faintly like the bioluminescent markings of a deep-sea creature. A pair of translucent wings sprouted from her back, their edges razor-sharp and vibrating with a soft hum that sent ripples through the stale air of the ship, the sound blending with the distant buzz of its failing systems. Her long, raven-black hair flowed like a dark waterfall, catching the green glow of the sword she held, a slender, deadly blade that seemed to hum with a life of its own, its emerald light casting an otherworldly sheen across her pale, pearlescent skin. Her eyes, the same vivid green as her weapon, locked onto Rook with a mix of disdain and curiosity, their intensity almost palpable, as if she could see right through him, to the defiance burning in his core. Her sharp features were set in a smirk that promised trouble, her high cheekbones and angular jaw giving her an air of regal authority, while the faint tilt of her head suggested she was already calculating his every possible move. "You're no survivor, human," Klyra's voice rang out, sharp and cold, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a blade through flesh. The Zerith around her hissed in agreement, their mandibles snapping as they leaned forward on their platforms, eager for the bloodshed to begin, their multifaceted eyes glinting with predatory delight. Klyra stepped closer, descending from the platform with a grace that was almost hypnotic, her wings trailing faint sparks as they brushed the air, leaving a trail of shimmering light in her wake. She stopped just inches from Rook, her sword raised so the glowing tip hovered dangerously close to his chest, the heat from the blade singeing the edge of his torn uniform. He could feel the prickling energy against his skin, a sharp reminder of how easily she could end him right then and there. Her breath was warm, almost too warm, as she leaned in, her lips brushing near his ear as she whispered, "Let's see how long you last." Her voice was a low, velvet purr, laced with a taunting edge that sent a shiver down his spine, not entirely from fear. Rook didn't flinch, though his heart was pounding hard enough that he was sure she could hear it. Instead, he tilted his head, his hazel eyes meeting hers with a cocky glint that caught her off guard. "Longer than you think, glow stick," he said, his voice low but steady, carrying a confidence that seemed almost absurd given the circumstances. His gaze flicked down for a split second, taking in the way her armor hugged her form, the faint glow of its patterns highlighting the curve of her hips, before snapping back to her face with a smirk. "Nice sword, by the way. Compensating for something?" For a moment, Klyra's smirk faltered, her eyes narrowing as a flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even intrigue, crossed her face. The crowd hissed louder, sensing the tension crackling between them, but Rook just shrugged, his casual defiance throwing them off. He might have been out of his depth, surrounded by a horde of alien killers in a ship that wanted him dead, but he wasn't about to let them see him sweat. Not yet, anyway. He shifted his grip on the broken metal shard, his knuckles whitening as he prepared for whatever came next, his mind already racing for a way to turn this nightmare into something he could survive. Klyra tilted her head, studying him with a newfound intensity, as if seeing him for the first time. "Bold words," she said, her voice a mix of amusement and challenge. "Let's see if you can back them up." Klyra stepped back, her wings buzzing with a sharp, electric hum that reverberated through the chamber, a sound that made the hairs on Rook's neck stand on end. She raised her sword high, the green glow casting long shadows across the crowd as she addressed them, her voice carrying over the excited clicks and hisses of the Zerith. "This is the trial of survival," she announced, her tone commanding and unyielding, each word dripping with authority. "You will face the maze, our maze. Survive its traps, its warriors, and you might earn a place among us. Fail, and you'll be nothing but dust on this ship's floor." The Zerith roared in approval, their clawed hands slamming against the platforms as they chanted in their guttural language, a cacophony of noise that filled the chamber with a primal energy. Some of the younger Zerith skittered closer, their wings buzzing as they jostled for a better view, their eyes glinting with bloodlust. Rook exhaled slowly, gripping his makeshift weapon tighter, his mind racing as he tried to process what he'd just heard. A maze full of traps and alien killers? Great. Just what he needed on a Monday, or whatever day it was out here in the void. Time had a funny way of losing meaning when you were fighting for your life. A massive hatch in the floor hissed open with a groan of ancient hydraulics, revealing a dark tunnel that led to the maze below. The air that wafted up from the depths carried a chill, tinged with the faint smell of rust and something metallic, blood, maybe, or the residue of whatever had died down there before him. Two Zerith guards, their exoskeletons gleaming with a sickly green sheen, grabbed Rook by the arms, their claws digging in his skin as they shoved him toward the edge with enough force to make him stumble. He caught himself just in time, his boots skidding on the grimy floor as he glared back at them. But they only hissed in response, their mandibles snapping inches from his face. Klyra's voice followed him, icy and taunting, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "Prove me wrong, human." With that, the guards pushed him, and he fell into the darkness, the air rushing past him as he plummeted. He hit the ground hard, landing on a metal grate below with a jarring thud that knocked the breath from his lungs. The hatch slammed shut above him with a deafening clang, leaving him alone in the dim, flickering light of the maze, the distant echoes of the crowd's chants fading into an eerie silence. Hey, if you're loving this story so far, don't miss what happens next. Things are about to get even crazier. A voice broke in, bright and enthusiastic, cutting through the tension of the moment. If you want to see if Rook can outsmart this deadly maze and make Klyra eat her words, hit that subscribe button right now. And don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an update. Trust me, you won't want to miss the sparks flying in this one, literally and figuratively. We're just getting started, and I promise it's going to be a wild ride. Let's dive back into the action. The maze was a labyrinth of death, a twisted network of rusted corridors and flickering lights that seemed to stretch on forever beneath the belly of the Aurora 7. The air down here was colder than Rook had expected, carrying a sharp bite that made his breath fog in front of him as he pushed himself to his feet. The metal grate beneath him groaned under his weight, its edges jagged and rusted, stained with streaks of something dark that he didn't want to think too hard about. Probably blood. Definitely not ketchup. He tightened his grip on the broken metal shard in his hand, its edges biting into his palm as he scanned his surroundings. The walls were a patchwork of dented panels and exposed wiring, some of which sparked intermittently, casting brief flashes of light that illuminated the narrow passage ahead. Somewhere in the distance, a low, guttural rumble echoed through the tunnels, followed by the faint skittering of claws on metal. The sound sent a shiver down his spine, but Rook forced himself to focus, his hazel eyes narrowing as he muttered under his breath. "All right, Rook, you've got this. Just another bad day. Survive the creepy alien maze, don't get eaten, and maybe you'll get that burger after all." He took a cautious step forward, his boots clanging softly against the grate, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. The passage branched off in 3 directions, each one looking equally uninviting. To the left, a faint green glow pulsed from around a corner, accompanied by the hum of something electrical, probably a trap. To the right, the corridor was littered with debris, shattered glass, twisted pipes, and what looked suspiciously like a human femur. Straight ahead, the path descended into darkness, the air growing colder with every step. Rook hesitated, weighing his options, when a deafening roar shook the maze, the sound so deep and primal it made his chest vibrate. The skittering grew louder, closer, and before he could decide which way to run, the source of the noise came barreling around the corner straight ahead. Zorak was a monster, even by Xerath standards. The warrior stood nearly 10 feet tall, his massive frame filling the corridor as he charged toward Rook with the force of a freight train. His exoskeleton was a deep, mottled gray, thick and segmented like natural armor, with jagged spines protruding from his shoulders and back that glinted in the dim light. 8 powerful legs propelled him forward, each one tipped with claws that scraped against the metal floor, leaving deep gouges in their wake. His mandibles, massive and serrated, snapped open and closed with a sickening click-clack, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that glistened with a sickly green venom. 2 of his legs ended in oversized pincers, each one large enough to crush a man's skull with ease. And as he moved, the pincers snapped at the air, eager for blood. His multifaceted eyes locked onto Rook, glowing with a predatory hunger, and a low growl rumbled from his throat as he slowed to a menacing crawl, his legs clicking rhythmically against the floor. The Xerath above, watching through cracked view screens mounted on the maze walls, roared with excitement, their chants echoing down to the tunnels. "Zorak! Zorak! Crush the human!" Rook froze for a split second, his mind racing as he took in the sheer size of his opponent. "Well, that's just great," he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he tightened his grip on the metal shard. I was hoping for something smaller, like, I don't know, a space rat? But no, I get the alien equivalent of a tank with legs. He forced a grin, more for his own sake than anyone else's, and shifted his stance, his eyes darting around the corridor for anything he could use to his advantage. Zorak let out another roar, his mandibles snapping as he lunged forward, one of his pincers swinging toward Rook with enough force to pulverize steel. Rook dove to the side, just in time, the pincer smashing into the wall where he'd been standing, sending a shower of sparks and debris raining down around him. The impact shook the floor, and Rook scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding as he ducked into the left corridor, the green glow growing brighter as he ran. The hum he'd heard earlier turned out to be a grid of exposed electrical wiring, the cables dangling from the ceiling and sparking dangerously, their tips glowing with a faint blue-white energy. Rook skidded to a stop, his boots slipping on the slick floor as he glanced back at Zorak. The Zereth warrior was already charging again, his 8 legs moving with terrifying speed for something so massive. Rook's mind raced, a plan forming as he noticed the way Zorak's bulk made him slightly unsteady around corners. His legs were strong, but they weren't built for sharp turns in tight spaces. "All right, big guy," Rook said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Let's see how you handle a little human ingenuity." He darted toward the electrical grid, weaving between the dangling cables as sparks singed the edges of his uniform. Zorak followed, his roars growing louder as he gained ground, one of his pincers snapping inches from Rook's back. Rook reached the far end of the corridor, where the grid was at its thickest, the cables forming a tangled curtain that buzzed with lethal energy. He turned to face Zorak, raising the metal shard like a taunt. "Come on, ugly," he shouted, his voice echoing through the maze. "You want me? Come and get me." Zorak didn't hesitate, his massive body hurtling forward with all the subtlety of a runaway asteroid. At the last second, Rook dove to the side, rolling across the floor as Zorak crashed through the grid. The cables snapped and sparked, wrapping around the Zereth's legs and pincers, and a surge of electricity coursed through his exoskeleton. Zorak let out a bone-rattling scream, his body convulsing as the voltage fried his nervous system, smoke rising from his armor as he collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud, his legs twitching weakly. Rook pushed himself to his feet, breathing hard as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The view screens above flickered, showing the stunned faces of the Zereth crowd, their chants dying in their throats as they stared in disbelief. Zorak, the undefeated champion of the maze, lay defeated at the hands of a human, a weak, weaponless human who wasn't even supposed to last a minute. Rook dusted off his hands, stepping over one of Zorak's still twitching legs as he caught his breath. "Humans don't need claws," he said, loud enough for the view screens to pick up, his voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and defiance. "We adapt." He glanced up at the near screen, knowing Klyra was watching from somewhere above, and flashed a cocky grin. "Guess I'm not as soft as you thought, huh?" The crowd's silence stretched on, broken only by the faint crackle of the broken electrical grid, and for the first time since he'd been thrown into the maze, Rook allowed himself a small, triumphant smirk. One down. Who knew how many more to go? But he'd be damned if he didn't keep fighting until he got out of this hellhole. Rook barely had time to catch his breath before the maze shifted around him, the walls groaning with the sound of ancient machinery grinding to life. The corridor where Zorak lay twitching sealed itself off with a hiss, a rusted panel sliding shut behind him, leaving the massive Zereth warrior trapped in the darkness. Rook exhaled sharply, his chest still heaving from the adrenaline of the fight, and wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The broken metal shard he'd been using as a weapon was still clenched in his fist, its edges now slick with his own sweat, and he couldn't help but glance at it with a wry smirk. "Not exactly a plasma sword," he muttered to himself, "but I guess it'll have to do." Above him, the view screens flickered, showing the Zereth crowd in the central chamber. Their earlier silence had given way to a mix of murmurs and hisses, their multifaceted eyes glinting with a new emotion. something between shock and reluctant intrigue. Rook had taken down Zorak, their champion, with nothing but a piece of scrap and a bit of human ingenuity. But he knew better than to think this was over. If anything, he just painted a bigger target on his back. A new sound echoed through the maze, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the patter of rain on a tin roof, but faster, more deliberate. Rook's head snapped up, his hazel eyes narrowing as he scanned the dim corridor ahead. The tapping grew louder, closer, and then he saw them. Two Zerith assassins emerging from the shadows at the far end of the passage. They were smaller than Zorak, their bodies leaner and more agile, built for speed rather than brute strength. The first assassin was male, his exoskeleton a deep, matte black that seemed to absorb the faint light, making him almost invisible against the rusted walls. His forelegs moved with a predatory grace, each step silent despite the metal floor, and his claws gleamed with a faint sheen of venom, their tips curved like scythes. A pair of short, jagged wings protruded from his back, buzzing faintly as he moved, giving him an extra burst of speed. The second assassin was female, and she was different. Her exoskeleton was a shimmering silver, catching the green glow of the emergency lights in a way that made her look almost ethereal. Her movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, her 6 legs weaving a dance of death as she advanced. Her wings were longer than her companions', their edges serrated and glinting with a deadly sharpness, and her multifaceted eyes locked onto Rook with a predatory intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. A faint smirk played across her mandibles, as if she knew something he didn't. "Well, this just keeps getting better," Rook said under his breath, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he tightened his grip on the metal shard. "2 of you now? What's next, a whole swarm?" He shifted his stance, his boots scraping against the floor as he backed up slowly, his mind racing for a plan. The assassins didn't give him much time to think. The male Zerith lunged first, his claws slashing through the air with terrifying speed, aiming for Rook's chest. Rook ducked just in time, the claws grazing the top of his head and slicing off a few strands of his brown hair. He rolled to the side, coming up in a crouch as the female assassin followed, her wings buzzing as she darted forward, her claws aiming for his legs. Rook jumped back, narrowly avoiding the strike, but the movement left him off balance, and he stumbled against the wall, his shoulders slamming into a rusted panel with a dull thud. The female assassin was on him in an instant, her movements a blur as she closed the distance between them. Before Rook could react, she was in his face, one of her claws pinning his wrist against the wall, the metal shard clattering to the floor with a sharp clang. Her other claw pressed against his chest, the tip digging into his torn uniform and leaving a thin, burning line across his skin. Up close, she was even more striking. Her silver exoskeleton shimmered with an almost liquid quality, and her eyes, a deep amber, glinted with a mix of amusement and danger. Her wings buzzed softly, the sound vibrating through the air as she leaned in, her mandibles inches from his face. Rook could feel the heat radiating from her body through the thin layer of her armor, and her breath was warm against his cheek as she hissed, "You're mine, human." Her claw trailed down his chest, the venom leaving a faint sting as it broke the skin, and for a moment, Rook forgot how to breathe, the proximity sending a jolt through him that was equal parts fear and something he wasn't quite ready to name. "Yeah, well," Rook managed to choke out, his voice hoarse but steady. "You're a little too close for your own good." He grabbed her wrist with his free hand, twisting it with a sharp jerk that caught her off guard. She hissed in surprise, her grip loosening just enough for him to shove her back, her wings buzzing as she stumbled into her companion. The male assassin snarled, his claws slashing toward Rook's side, but Rook was already moving, scooping up the metal shard and diving into a narrow side passage. His heart pounded in his chest as he ran, the sound of the assassin's claws scraping against the floor echoing behind him. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. These two were faster, smarter, and a hell of a lot more coordinated than Zorak had been. The passage opened into a wider chamber, this one littered with the remnants of the ship's old equipment. shattered monitors, tangled wires, and a few broken panels that glinted faintly in the dim light. Rook's eyes darted around, searching for anything he could use. Then he saw it, a shard of broken glass from one of the monitors, its surface reflecting the faint green glow of the emergency lights. An idea clicked into place, and he grabbed the glass, tucking it into his belt as he turned to face the assassins. They entered the chamber seconds later, their wings buzzing as they split up, the male circling to the left while the female advanced straight toward him, her claws raised. "You can't run forever, human," she hissed, her voice a low, taunting purr that sent another shiver down his spine. The maze seemed to hold its breath as Rook staggered through the corridor, one hand pressed against the gash on his shoulder where the male assassin's venomous claw had sliced into him. The wound burned like fire, a searing pain that spread down his arm with every step, and his vision blurred at the edges, the venom starting to take its toll. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his torn uniform clinging to his sweat-soaked skin, but he forced himself to keep moving, his boots clanging against the rusted grates beneath him. The view screens above flickered with static, the chants of the Zereth crowd growing louder, more frenzied, their voices a guttural roar that echoed through the tunnels. "Klyra! Klyra!" And the human. Rook's lips twitched into a grim smile, despite the pain. "Guess I've got their attention now," he muttered, his voice hoarse but steady. He knew what was coming. He'd taken down Zorak, outsmarted the assassins, and now the Zereth weren't playing games anymore. They were sending in their best, and he had a pretty good idea who that might be. The air grew heavier, almost oppressive, as if the maze itself sensed the arrival of a predator far deadlier than any Rook had faced so far. The flickering lights dimmed further, casting the corridor into a patchwork of shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. The temperature dropped, a chill seeping into his bones that had nothing to do with the ship's failing systems, and the faint hum of machinery was drowned out by a new sound. A sharp electric buzz like a swarm of hornets amplified 1,000 times, vibrating through the metal walls with an intensity that made Rook's teeth ache. He froze, his hazel eyes narrowing as he scanned the dim passage ahead, his heart pounding in his chest. The buzz grew louder, closer, and then he saw her. Klyra stepped into view at the far end of the corridor, her presence commanding, almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere of the maze bent to her will. Her black armor gleamed under the green glow of the emergency lights, the intricate patterns pulsing with a faint energy that made her look like a living weapon, each shimmer a testament to the advanced technology woven into the suit. Her wings, translucent and razor-sharp, buzzed softly as she advanced, their edges glinting with a deadly sheen that caught the light in a mesmerizing dance of danger. The sword in her hand, the same glowing green blade she'd taunted him with earlier, hummed with a life of its own, its light casting an eerie glow across her pale, pearlescent skin, illuminating the sharp angles of her face in a way that made her look both beautiful and terrifying. Her long, raven-black hair flowed like a dark waterfall, catching the light in a cascade of shimmering strands, and her emerald eyes locked onto Rook, burning with a mix of fury and something else, something that might have been respect, or maybe just the thrill of a challenge. She tilted her head, her sharp features set in a smirk that promised violence, her high cheekbones and angular jaw giving her an air of regal authority that made her seem untouchable. "You've lasted longer than I thought, human," Klyra's voice rang out, cold and commanding, cutting through the silence like a blade through flesh. Her tone was laced with a taunting edge, each word a challenge that hung heavy in the air between them. She took a step forward, her wings buzzing louder, sending a ripple of energy through the corridor that made the lights flicker even more erratically. "I expected you to be a smear on the floor by now," she continued, her smirk widening as she raised her sword, the green light reflecting in her eyes like twin flames, giving her an almost otherworldly aura. "But this ends now. Face me." Her voice dropped to a low purr, the sound sending a shiver down Rook's spine that he couldn't quite suppress, a mix of fear and something he wasn't ready to name. Rook straightened, wincing as the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his shoulder, the venom burning deeper into his muscles. He tightened his grip on the metal shard, his knuckles whitening as he met her gaze with a defiant grin, his hazel eyes glinting with a stubborn resolve that caught her off guard. "Took you long enough, glow stick," he said, his voice steady despite the venom coursing through his veins, the sarcasm in his tone a shield against the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. "I was starting to think you were scared to get your hands dirty." He shifted his stance, his boots scraping against the floor as he braced himself, his mind racing for a plan even as his body screamed in protest. Klyra's smirk widened, her wings buzzing with a sharp, electric hum that made the air crackle with tension. "Bold words," she replied, her voice a low, velvet purr that sent another shiver down his spine, this one tinged with something dangerously close to anticipation. "Let's see if you can back them up." With that, she moved, no hesitation, no wind-up, just a blur of motion as she closed the distance between them in the blink of an eye, her sword slashing through the air where Rook's head had been a fraction of a second earlier. Rook dove to the side, the blade missing him by inches, its heat singeing the edge of his uniform as he rolled across the floor, his shoulders screaming in protest at the sudden movement. Sparks flew as the sword carved a glowing arc into the metal wall, the energy discharge crackling through the air with a sharp snap that echoed through the corridor. He came up in a crouch, his heart pounding in his chest as Klyra lunged again, her movements fluid and precise, each strike a seamless extension of the last, a deadly dance that left no room for error. She was fast, faster than the assassins, faster than anything he'd ever faced, and every move was calculated, a trap leading into something deadlier. Rook ducked under a horizontal slash, the blade passing so close to his face that he felt the heat on his skin, a burning sensation that made his eyes water. He twisted away from a follow-up strike aimed at his ribs, his boots slipping on the slick floor as he scrambled to keep his footing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Okay," he panted, dodging another swipe that left a scorch mark on the wall behind him, the metal sizzling where the blade had struck. "Just gonna say it. This feels a little unfair." Klyra's response was a cold laugh, her wings buzzing as she pressed the attack, her sword a blur of green light that seemed to be everywhere at once, a relentless storm of energy that threatened to overwhelm him. Rook was on the defensive, his movements growing sluggish as the venom sapped his strength, each dodge and roll taking more out of him than the last. His vision blurred further, the edges of his sight tinged with a sickly green that matched the glow of Klyra's sword, and his legs felt like they were made of lead, each step a monumental effort. But he forced himself to focus, his mind racing for a way to turn the tide, even as his body begged him to give up. Klyra was good, better than good, but she wasn't perfect. He noticed the way she favored her right side, the way her strikes had a rhythm, a pattern he could exploit if he could just survive long enough to find an opening. He ducked under another slash, the blade slicing through the air above him with a high-pitched whine, and rolled behind a rusted crate for cover, his shoulder slamming into the metal with a dull thud that sent a fresh wave of pain through him. He peeked out just in time to see Klyra's sword carved through the crate like it was paper, the two halves falling apart with a loud clang that echoed through the corridor, the sound ringing in his ears like a death knell. "You can't hide from me, human," Klyra said, her voice dripping with amusement as she stalked forward, her wings casting long, jagged shadows across the floor, her movements slow and deliberate now, like a predator toying with its prey. "You fought well, but this is where it ends." "Maybe," Rook said, his voice strained but defiant, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath, "but I've got a bad habit of disappointing people who underestimate me." He lunged out from behind the crate, aiming the metal shard at her side, a desperate move born of instinct more than strategy. But Klyra was ready, her sword deflecting the strike with a shower of sparks, the impact sending a jolt up Rook's arm that made his teeth rattle. She moved faster than he could react, her free hand grabbing his wrist and twisting it hard, forcing him to drop the shard with a grunt of pain, the metal clattering to the floor with a sharp clang. Before he could recover, she spun, her wings buzzing with a sharp, electric hum as she slammed him against the wall, pinning him there with her body, her strength far greater than his in his weakened state. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, a sharp gasp escaping his lips as his back hit the rusted metal. The cold surface a stark contrast to the heat radiating from Klyra's armor. For a moment, time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the space between them. Klyra's body pressed against his, the faint glow of her armor's patterns illuminating the shadows, casting a soft green light across his face. He could feel the warmth of her through the thin material, her chest rising and falling with each breath, the rhythm almost hypnotic despite the danger. Her wings buzzed softly, the sound vibrating through the air as she leaned in, her emerald eyes boring into his with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. Her sword was at his throat, the glowing tip pressing just hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. The heat of the blade, a constant reminder of how easily she could end him. Her breath was hot against his cheek, her lips hovering just inches from his as she whispered, "You fight well." Her voice was a mix of grudging respect and something darker, something that sent a jolt through him despite the pain, a tension that crackled between them like static electricity. She tilted her head, her hair brushing against his shoulder as she studied him, her gaze flicking down to his lips for a fraction of a second before returning to his eyes. "But not well enough," she added, her tone a low purr that made his stomach twist in a way he wasn't sure he liked. Rook swallowed hard, his throat dry as he managed a weak grin, his voice hoarse but steady. This is a nice view," he said, his words half a taunt, half a genuine observation, the sarcasm a shield against the fear and the strange heat pooling in his chest. For a split second, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, maybe, or amusement, her pupils dilating slightly as her breath hitched, her lips parting just enough to reveal a glimpse of her sharp, pointed teeth. Her wings buzzed louder, the sound a low hum that vibrated through him. And for a moment, he thought she might close the distance between them, the tension between them almost palpable, a pull that neither of them could fully ignore. But then her expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she regained her composure, the moment shattering like glass. Klyra pulled back, her sword still at his throat, but the brief moment of hesitation was all Rook needed. He moved before she could react, using the last of his strength to twist out of her grip, his foot hooking around her ankle as he pulled her off balance. She stumbled, her wings buzzing erratically as she tried to catch herself, her sword arm faltering for just a second. Rook seized the opportunity, grabbing her wrist with both hands and slamming it against the wall, the impact sending a jolt of pain through his injured shoulder that made him grit his teeth. Klyra hissed in frustration, her strength pushing back against him. But he held on, using his body weight to keep her pinned, his chest heaving as he forced her to drop the sword. The blade clattered to the floor, its green glow dimming as it skidded away, the hum fading into silence as it came to a stop against a rusted grate. Klyra's wings buzzed with fury, their sharp edges grazing his side as she struggled against him, drawing thin lines of blood that stung like fire. But Rook didn't let go, his arm wrapping around her throat in a chokehold as he pressed himself against her back, using the wall to keep her pinned. Her armor was cold against his chest, a stark contrast to the heat of her body beneath it, and he could feel her muscles tensing as she fought to break free, her strength far greater than his in his weakened state. But the venom had slowed him less than it had her. She hadn't expected him to last this long, and that underestimation was her downfall. "I told you," Rook panted, his voice low and fierce, his breath hot against her ear as he tightened his grip. "I fight to survive, not to kill." His words were a growl, a promise, and for a moment, he felt her go still, her wings drooping as she exhaled sharply, her body relaxing just enough to signal her surrender. The view screens above flickered, showing the crowd's reaction, a stunned silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the faint crackle of the ship's failing systems. Rook had done the impossible. He disarmed Klyra, their greatest warrior, and lived to tell the tale. He released her, stepping back as he retrieved her sword, holding it up with a shaky hand, its green glow reflecting in his hazel eyes like a trophy. His chest heaved with each breath, his body screaming in protest, but he forced himself to stand tall, his gaze never leaving Klyra's. "And you," he said, his voice steady despite the pain, "are one hell of a fighter. But I'm not done yet." Klyra pushed herself off the wall, her wings buzzing softly as she straightened, her emerald eyes studying him with a new intensity, her breath still coming in sharp gasps from the struggle. For the first time, there was no smirk on her face, no taunt in her gaze, just a quiet, calculating respect that made Rook's stomach twist in a way he wasn't sure he liked. The crowd above erupted into a mix of hisses and roars, their reaction a chaotic blend of shock and awe, their mandibles clicking in a frenzy as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Rook glanced up at the view screens, his vision still blurry, but his resolve unshaken, and flashed a bloody grin, his teeth stained with red from a split lip he hadn't even noticed until now. "What's next?" he called out, his voice carrying a defiance that silenced the crowd, the words echoing through the maze like a challenge. He turned back to Klyra, his grip on the sword tightening as he prepared for whatever she might throw at him next, but she didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head, her wings folding against her back as she crossed her arms, her gaze never leaving his. "You're different," she said at last, her voice low, almost thoughtful, as if she were seeing him for the first time. "Not a warrior, not a predator. So what are you, human?" Rook exhaled slowly, his grin fading into something softer, something tired but resolute. "A survivor," he said simply, the word carrying a weight that seemed to resonate with her, a truth that cut through the tension between them. He lowered the sword, his arm trembling from the effort, but his eyes never left hers, a silent challenge passing between them. The maze had tested him, pushed him to his limits, but he'd survived. Zorak, the assassins, and now Klyra herself. He was battered, bleeding, and barely standing, but he was still here, still fighting, and that was more than anyone had expected from a human. The view screens flickered again, the crowd's roars growing louder, but Rook barely heard them, his focus entirely on Klyra. She took a step forward, her wings buzzing softly, and for a moment he thought she might attack again. But instead, she stopped, her gaze softening just enough to hint at something new, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The silence that followed Rook's defiance hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that seemed to press against the walls of the maze. His chest heaved with each labored breath, the venom still burning through his veins, but he stood tall, Klyra's glowing green sword clutched in his trembling hand, its light casting long shadows across the rusted corridor. The gash on his shoulder throbbed with a dull ache, blood seeping through the torn fabric of his uniform, and his legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but his hazel eyes burned with a fierce determination that refused to waver. The view screens above flickered wildly, their static-filled images showing the Zereth crowd in the central chamber, their multifaceted eyes wide with shock, their mandibles clicking in a chaotic rhythm that betrayed their disbelief. Rook had disarmed Klyra, their greatest warrior, their pride, their symbol of dominance, and lived to tell the tale. The impossible had happened, and the maze, for the first time since he'd been thrown into it, felt like it might just let him breathe. Klyra stood a few paces away, her wings drooping slightly as she rubbed her wrist where Rook had slammed it against the wall, her emerald eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his stomach twist. Her black armor still shimmered with its faint energy patterns, the glow dimmed but not extinguished, and her raven black hair hung in disarray around her sharp features, framing a face that was no longer twisted with fury but softened with something new, something that might have been respect, or perhaps a grudging curiosity. She tilted her head, her wings buzzing softly as she straightened, her gaze never leaving his. "You're different," she said at last, her voice low and thoughtful, the taunting edge gone, replaced by a tone that carried the weight of her reevaluation. "Not a warrior, not a predator. "So what are you, human?" Her words hung in the air, a question that seemed to demand an answer, and Rook felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders, heavier than the pain or the exhaustion. Rook exhaled slowly, his grin fading into something softer, something tired but resolute. He lowered the sword, his arm trembling from the effort, but his eyes never left hers, a silent challenge passing between them. "A survivor," he said simply, the word carrying a quiet strength that seemed to resonate with her, a truth that cut through the tension like a blade. He wiped a trickle of blood from his split lip with the back of his hand, the taste of copper lingering on his tongue, and leaned against the wall for support, his body screaming for rest. The crowd above erupted into a mix of hisses and roars, their reaction a chaotic blend of shock and awe, their mandibles clicking in a frenzy as they processed what they'd just witnessed. The view screens flickered again, zooming in on Rook's battered form, his torn uniform stained with blood and grime, his face etched with exhaustion but lit with a defiant spark that refused to be extinguished. A deep, resonant voice cut through the noise, booming from the speakers mounted on the maze walls. The voice of the Zereth leader, a towering figure whose silhouette loomed on the screens, his exoskeleton a deep, iridescent black that shimmered with authority. "You came as prey," the leader intoned, his words slow and deliberate, each one heavy with the weight of judgment. "You stand as a force." The declaration sent a ripple through the crowd, their roars growing louder, more chaotic, as if they couldn't decide whether to cheer or jeer. Rook glanced up at the screens, his vision still blurry from the venom, but he caught the leader's gaze, or at least the approximation of it through those multifaceted eyes, and gave a weak nod, his grin returning despite the pain. "Takes more than a maze to break a human," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be picked up by the microphones, the words a quiet boast that seemed to hang in the air. Klyra stepped forward, her wings buzzing softly, and for a moment, Rook thought she might attack again, her posture tense, her hands flexing as if she were itching to reclaim her sword. But instead, she stopped a few feet away, her gaze softening just enough to hint at something new, something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or maybe just the flicker of a challenge she wasn't ready to let go. She closed the distance between them, her movements slow and deliberate, her wings folding against her back as she came to a stop just inches from him. The air seemed to thicken, the faint hum of her armor blending with the crackle of the maze's failing systems, and Rook felt his breath catch as she reached out, her hand brushing against his uninjured shoulder. Her touch was light, almost hesitant, her fingers trailing down his arm with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence of their fight, the warmth of her skin seeping through the thin fabric of his sleeve. Her claws grazed his skin, leaving faint red lines that stung but didn't break the surface, and she leaned in, her breath hot against his ear as she whispered, "Next time, I'll test you closer." Her voice was a low purr, laced with a promise that made his pulse quicken, as she pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, her emerald eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and something darker, something that sent a shiver down his spine despite the exhaustion weighing him down. Rook swallowed hard, his throat dry, and managed a crooked grin, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'm counting on it," he replied, the words a challenge of his own, his eyes locking with hers in a silent acknowledgement of the tension that still crackled between them. The view screens flickered again, the crowd's roars fading into a low murmur as the Zereth leader raised a clawed hand, silencing them with a single gesture. "The human has proven his worth," the leader declared, his voice resonating through the maze, each word a pronouncement that carried the weight of their society's judgment. "He will not be prey. He will be something more." The words hung in the air, ambiguous but heavy with meaning, and Rook felt a surge of pride despite the pain, a quiet triumph that made him stand a little straighter. Klyra stepped back, her wings buzzing softly as she crossed her arms, her gaze never leaving his, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of a smile on her lips, gone so quickly he might have imagined it. The leader continued, his voice lowering to a tone that suggested negotiation rather than judgment. Klyra will offer you a place among us. Teach us your ways, human. Your resilience intrigues us. Rook blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in through the haze of exhaustion and venom. A place among the Zirith? Teaching them? He glanced at Klyra, her expression unreadable but her eyes still fixed on him, and then back at the view screens, where the crowd watched in silence, their curiosity palpable. Teach you, he said, his voice cracking with a laugh that turned into a cough, his body protesting the effort. All right, but first things first. I need a shower, some decent food, and a gallon of coffee. Maybe a burger, too. Deep fried if you've got it. The crowd hissed, a sound that might have been amusement or confusion. But Klyra's lips twitched, a hint of a smile breaking through her stoic facade. You drive a hard bargain, human, she said, her tone lighter now, almost playful, and she turned to the view screens, her wings buzzing as she gave a sharp nod to the leader. The maze began to shift again, the walls groaning as hidden panels slid open, revealing a path back to the central chamber. Rook stumbled as he took his first step, the venom making his legs wobble, but Klyra was there, her hand steadying him with a grip that was firm but not harsh. Her touch lingered for a moment longer than necessary, her fingers brushing against his arm as she guided him forward, and Rook felt a strange warmth spread through him despite the pain, a mix of relief and something he couldn't quite name. The journey back was a blur, the corridor widening into the massive arena where the Zirith crowd awaited, their eyes glinting with a new kind of interest. The leader stood at the center, his towering form casting a shadow that stretched across the floor, and as Rook approached, he felt the weight of their stares, a mix of awe and uncertainty that made his skin prickle. He stopped before the leader, Klyra at his side, and handed her the sword, its green glow dimming as she took it, her fingers brushing his in a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through him. You've earned this, he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion, but I'm keeping the metal shard. Sentimentality, you know. Klyra's eyes narrowed, but the hint of a smile returned, and she nodded, accepting the sword with a grace that belied the ferocity of their earlier fight. The leader raised a claw, his voice booming once more. The human will stay. He will teach, and we will watch. The crowd roared again, their chants shifting to a rhythmic beat that echoed through the chamber, a sound that felt almost like a welcome, however alien it might be. Rook turned to Klyra, his grin returning as he leaned against the wall, his body finally giving in to the need for rest. So, he said, his voice low, what's the first lesson? Surviving you. She laughed, a sharp, unexpected sound that caught him off guard, and stepped closer, her wings buzzing softly as she leaned in, her breath warm against his cheek. Perhaps, she whispered, her voice a teasing promise, but we'll start with something easier. Rest first, human. You've earned it. Rook chuckled, the sound turning into a cough as he slid down the wall, his vision fading at the edges. As he closed his eyes, he caught a final glimpse of Klyra standing over him, her silhouette framed by the flickering lights, and a thought drifted through his mind. Hazy but clear, humans don't need tech or wings. We've got grit. The maze faded into darkness, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew this was just the beginning. The Aurora, Seven hummed around him, its ancient systems groaning as the Zirith prepared for the next chapter of their strange alliance. Through the cracked view screen above, a faint star twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world he'd come from, and Rook smiled, his breathing evening out as he drifted into an uneasy sleep. The maze had tested him, broken him, and rebuilt him, and now, as he lay there, surrounded by alien eyes and the hum of a foreign world, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. The Zirith might have underestimated him, but he'd shown them what a human could do, and he had a feeling Klyra was just getting started with her tests. The thought made him grin even as he slipped into unconsciousness, the promise of coffee and a burger a distant dream that kept him going.